Dear beloved brothers and sisters in Christ, grace and peace be with you tonight. As we gather in the quiet hours when the world grows still, I want to share with you one of the most shocking and mysterious stories from our sacred scriptures. Tonight, we will walk through the ancient cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, where God himself came down to investigate crimes so terrible that their very outcry reached the throne of heaven. What were these 5 sins so wicked that they moved the heart of our merciful God to rain fire from the sky? What mysteries lie hidden in these ancient ruins that still speak to us today? Come with me now, as we step back through time to witness the rise and fall of 2 cities whose names have echoed through history as warnings to all humanity. Let your heart be still, your mind at peace, as we walk through this sacred mystery together. Chapter 1. Whispers of Ancient Doom. In the days when Abraham walked with God, when the earth was still young, and the memory of the great flood lingered in the hearts of men, there existed a valley so beautiful that it seemed like a piece of heaven itself had fallen to earth. The Jordan Valley stretched out like a green carpet woven by the hands of the Almighty, where crystal rivers caught the golden light of dawn and reflected it back to the sky like liquid fire. Here, in this place of wonder, 2 cities rose from the fertile plains like jewels set in a crown of emerald grass. Sodom and Gomorrah stood proud and tall, their walls gleaming white in the morning sun, their gates busy with merchants and travelers from every corner of the known world. The air was sweet with the scent of date palms and fig trees, and the markets overflowed with spices from distant lands, silks that shimmered like captured rainbows, and gold that glinted like fallen stars. The people of these cities wore fine clothes and lived in houses of stone and cedar. Their tables groaned under the weight of bread and wine, meat and honey. Children played in gardens where fountains sang their endless songs, and the sound of laughter carried on the warm evening breeze. To any traveller passing through, these cities appeared blessed beyond measure, favoured by heaven itself. But high on the hills that overlooked this valley of plenty, an old man sat in the doorway of his tent, watching and waiting. Abraham, the friend of God, had pitched his dwelling in the heights, where the air was thin and clear, where the stars seemed close enough to touch. Night after night, he would sit beneath the vast dome of heaven, his weathered hands folded in prayer, his eyes fixed on the cities below. Something was wrong. Abraham felt it in his bones, in the way the wind seemed to carry whispers of things that should not be. Sometimes, when the night was very still, he thought he could hear distant cries carried on the air, sounds that made his heart heavy with sorrow. The smoke that rose from the city's fires seemed thicker than it should be, darker, tinged with something that made him turn his face away. As the seasons turned and the years passed, Abraham noticed changes in the valley below. The laughter from the cities grew louder, but somehow hollow, like the sound of empty vessels being struck. The lights that burned in the windows at night seemed to flicker with an unnatural colour, and the very air above the cities began to shimmer with a heat that had nothing to do with the sun. Then came the day when heaven itself took notice. Abraham was sitting in the heat of the day, seeking shade beneath the oak trees near his tent, when he saw them coming across the shimmering desert. At first, they appeared as mere figures in the distance, wavering like mirages in the burning air. But as they drew closer, Abraham felt his breath catch in his throat. These were no ordinary travelers. They walked with a grace that seemed to make the very earth beneath their feet holy. Their garments were white as fresh snow on mountain peaks, and though the sun blazed overhead, they cast no shadow. When they spoke, their voices carried the sound of distant thunder, gentle yet filled with power that made the ground tremble. These were angels, messengers of the Most High, sent on a mission that would shake the foundations of the world. The leader of the three beings looked toward the valley where Sodom and Gomorrah lay basking in the afternoon sun. His eyes, bright as burning coals, seemed to see through stone and flesh into the very hearts of the people below. When he spoke, his words fell like drops of honey mixed with fire. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin so grievous, that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. Abraham felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. The outcry. What terrible things were happening in those beautiful cities that their very wickedness could rise up to heaven like smoke from a burning sacrifice? What sins were so dark, so twisted, that they moved the heart of God himself to come down and investigate? As the afternoon wore on, and the shadows grew long, Abraham found himself walking with one of the heavenly visitors along the ridge that looked down into the valley. Below them, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah spread out like a picture painted on the earth, their walls golden in the setting sun, their gardens green and lush. But the angel beside him saw something different. Where Abraham saw prosperity and beauty, the messenger of God saw corruption eating away at the foundations like rot in beautiful fruit. Where Abraham heard the sounds of busy marketplaces and happy homes, the angel heard the cries of the oppressed and the whispers of unnatural desires. There are mysteries here, the angel said, his voice soft as evening wind but heavy with sadness. 5 great sins that have woven themselves into the very stones of these cities. 5 abominations that have turned paradise into a place of darkness. Abraham felt his heart breaking as he listened. He thought of his nephew Lot, who had chosen to make his home in Sodom with his wife and daughters. He thought of the innocent children playing in the streets below, unaware that judgment was coming like a storm on the horizon. "Tell me," Abraham whispered, his voice barely audible above the evening breeze. "What are these sins that have brought heaven's attention to this place?" The angel turned to look at him, and in those ancient eyes, Abraham saw both justice and mercy warring together. The first mystery is the corruption of love itself, twisted into something dark and unnatural. The second is the pride that has made them think themselves equal to God. The third is their cruelty to strangers and the poor. The fourth is their hardness of heart toward those in need. And the fifth, the angel paused, and thunder rolled across the clear sky. The fifth is their stubborn refusal to turn from their evil ways, even when mercy is offered. As night fell over the valley, strange lights began to dance in the air above the cities. Not the warm glow of oil lamps or cooking fires, but something else entirely, something that made the stars themselves seem to dim in fear. Abraham spent that night in prayer, wrestling with God like his grandson Jacob would one day wrestle with an angel. He pleaded for the cities, bargaining for the lives of the innocent, asking if God would spare the place for the sake of 50 righteous people. Then 45, then 40, then 30, then 20, then 10. Each time the Lord answered with patience and love, promising that he would not destroy the city if even 10 righteous souls could be found within its walls. But as the first light of dawn broke over the eastern hills, Abraham looked down into the valley and saw 2 of the angels walking through the gates of Sodom. Their mission was clear: to search every street, every house, every heart, looking for even a small flame of righteousness in the gathering darkness. The mystery was about to be solved. The 5 sins that had brought heaven's judgment were about to be laid bare. And Abraham, standing on his lonely hill, could only watch and pray as the fate of 2 cities hung in the balance. In the distance, a flock of birds rose suddenly from the trees near Sodom, as if startled by something unseen. The wind shifted, carrying a scent that made Abraham cover his face with his cloak. It smelled of sulfur and smoke, of things burning that were never meant to burn. The investigation was beginning, and soon the whole world would know what happens when paradise becomes hell, when blessing becomes curse, when the patience of heaven finally reaches its end. Chapter 2. The first sin: rampant sexual immorality. As the sun set behind the western hills and the evening stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the 2 angels made their way through the gates of Sodom. The city was just coming alive with the activities of night, and what they saw there would have made the very stones cry out in horror if stones could weep. The first sin that had brought heaven's attention to this place was like a disease that had infected every corner of the city. What God had created as beautiful and holy between a man and his wife had been twisted into something dark and shameful. The very air seemed thick with desires that should never have been awakened, passions that burned not with the pure flame of love, but with the destructive fire of lust. In the beginning, God had looked upon all that he had made and called it good. He had created Adam and Eve, and when he brought them together, he blessed their union and called it holy. The joining of husband and wife was meant to be a picture of God's own love for his people, pure and faithful and true. But in Sodom, this sacred gift had been trampled in the dust and twisted into forms that would have made the angels in heaven weep. As darkness fell over the city, the streets filled with people whose eyes burned with unholy desires. Men who should have been faithful husbands wandered the alleys looking for pleasures that were forbidden. Women who should have been devoted wives sold their bodies for gold and silver. The sound of drunken laughter mixed with cries of shame echoed off the stone walls. But it was not just the unfaithfulness between husbands and wives that had caught heaven's attention. In the darker corners of the city, in the shadows where decent people feared to walk, even worse things were happening. Men were turning away from the natural love of women and burning with lust for other men. Women were abandoning their God-given roles and seeking unnatural pleasures with their own kind. The angels walked through these streets with heavy hearts, seeing how far the people had fallen from the image of God in which they had been created. Every corner seemed to hold new horrors, new ways that the sacred had been made profane. Children, who should have been protected and cherished, were being used for the twisted pleasures of adults. The weak were preyed upon by the strong, and innocence was bought and sold like any other commodity in the marketplace. As the night grew deeper, the 2 heavenly visitors made their way toward the house of Lot, Abraham's nephew who had chosen to make his home in this city of sin. Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city, as was the custom of respected men, when he saw the strangers approaching. Something in their bearing, in the way they moved with grace and dignity through the corrupt streets, told him that these were not ordinary travelers. Lot rose quickly and bowed low before them, his heart filled with the fear of the Lord that his uncle Abraham had taught him. He knew the laws of hospitality, the sacred duty to protect and care for strangers. Even more, something in his spirit recognized that these visitors were holy, set apart, dangerous to be near if one's heart was not right with God. "My lords," Lot said, his voice trembling with respect and fear, "please turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night, and then go on your way in the morning." But the angels seemed to test him, as if they wanted to see how deep his commitment to righteousness truly ran. "No," they replied, "we will spend the night in the square." Lot's blood ran cold at these words. He knew what happened to strangers who spent the night in the public squares of Sodom. He had seen it before, had heard the screams and closed his ears, had shut his doors and tried to forget. But he couldn't let these holy visitors fall prey to the demons that prowled the streets of his city. "Please, my lords," he begged, falling to his knees before them, "I insist that you come to my house. It is not safe for you here. Please, I beg you, come with me." His desperation seemed to move them, and they agreed to come to his home. Lot prepared a feast for them, baking bread without yeast, preparing meat and wine, doing everything he could to honor these mysterious visitors. But even as they ate, he could hear the sounds from the streets outside growing louder and more wild. The men of Sodom had noticed the strangers entering the city. Word had spread like fire through dry grass that 2 young men of unusual beauty had come to spend the night. And now, as the darkness deepened, they began to gather outside Lot's house like wolves drawn by the scent of blood. First came a few of the worst men in the city, those who were known for their unnatural desires and violent ways. But as the night wore on, more and more joined them, until it seemed like every male in Sodom had gathered outside Lot's door. Young men and old men, rich and poor, servants and masters, all united in their twisted hunger for these strangers. The sound of their voices rose like the roar of wild beasts. They pounded on Lot's door with their fists, shouting and cursing, demanding that he bring out his visitors so they could satisfy their lusts. The very air seemed to shake with their rage and desire. "Lot!" they screamed, their voices blending into one horrible chorus. "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can know them." The word they used for know was not the innocent word of friendship or acquaintance. It was the word used for the most intimate joining of man and woman, but twisted here into something unnatural and violent. They wanted to force themselves upon these strangers, to take by violence what should only be given in love. Lot's heart was breaking as he heard the demands of his neighbors. These were men he had lived among for years, men whose children played with his daughters, men he had called friends. But now they stood outside his door like demons from the pit, their faces twisted with lust and rage. In desperation, Lot opened the door and stepped outside, closing it quickly behind him. He held up his hands, trying to calm the mob, his voice shaking as he pleaded with them. "No, my friends," he cried, "don't do this wicked thing. These men are my guests, under my protection. I cannot let you harm them." But the crowd only grew more angry at his words. They pressed closer, their eyes gleaming with an unholy light, their hands reaching out like claws. The smell of wine and sweat and something else, something rotten and evil, filled the air around them. "Get out of our way," they shouted. "Who are you to judge us? You came here as a foreigner, and now you want to act like our ruler? We'll treat you worse than them." They surged forward like a wave of darkness, ready to break down the door and take what they wanted by force. But even as they reached for Lot, something happened that none of them expected. The door behind Lot opened, and two hands reached out and pulled him inside. The angels had come to his rescue, and with their touch came a power that the men of Sodom had never imagined. A blinding light flashed across the crowd, and suddenly every man standing outside Lot's house was struck blind. They stumbled around in the darkness, bumping into each other, falling over themselves, their cries of rage turning to wails of confusion and fear. But even in their blindness, even with this clear sign of divine power, they didn't give up their evil desires. They kept groping around the door, trying to find their way in, still hungry for the violence and perversion they had planned. Inside the house, Lot fell to his knees before the angels, his whole body shaking with fear and gratitude. Now he knew, without any doubt, who these visitors were. Only messengers of the Most High could have power like this, could strike an entire mob blind with a mere touch. The angels looked at him with eyes full of sadness and pity. They had seen what they came to see. The first of the 5 great sins was laid bare before them in all its horrible reality. The people of Sodom had taken God's gift of love and turned it into a weapon of violence and perversion. They had abandoned the natural order that God had established and given themselves over to desires that burned like fire but gave no warmth, only destruction. "Do you have anyone else here?" one of the angels asked Lot, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Sons-in-law, sons or daughters, or anyone else in the city who belongs to you? Get them out of here, because we are going to destroy this place. The outcry to the Lord against its people is so great that he has sent us to destroy it." As the night wore on, and the blind men outside gradually gave up their search and stumbled away, Lot sat with the angels and wept. He thought of his daughters, still unmarried, still innocent. He thought of the young men who had promised to wed them, good men who might yet be saved. He thought of all the children in the city, the babies, who had never chosen the evil that surrounded them. But the angel's message was clear. The time for mercy was running out. The first mystery had been solved, and it was even worse than heaven had feared. The sexual immorality of Sodom was not just a private sin between consenting adults. It was a violent, predatory force that threatened anyone who came within its reach. It was the complete corruption of something that God had made beautiful and holy. As dawn approached, the sounds from the city grew quieter, but not because the people were sleeping. In the distance, Lot could hear strange noises, like the earth itself was groaning under the weight of so much sin. The very foundations of the city seemed to be trembling, as if they could no longer bear what was built upon them. The first sin had been exposed, but it was only the beginning. 4 more mysteries remained to be solved, 4 more abominations that had brought heaven's judgment upon this place. And with each revelation, the case for destruction grew stronger, the evidence more overwhelming. The night was ending, but for Sodom and Gomorrah, a much longer and darker night was about to begin. Chapter 3. The second sin, pride and arrogance. As the first light of dawn began to creep across the sky, painting the eastern hills with soft shades of gold and pink, the angels prepared to continue their investigation. They had seen the first sin in all its horrible glory, but there were still 4 more mysteries to solve, 4 more abominations that had brought heaven's attention to these doomed cities. The second sin was perhaps more subtle than the first, but in many ways it was even more dangerous. It was the sin that had brought down Lucifer himself, the bright morning star who had been cast out of heaven like lightning. It was pride, the poison that turned angels into demons and men into monsters. In the growing light of morning, the angels walked through the streets of Sodom and saw this sin written in every stone, carved into every building, visible in every face they passed. The people of these cities had been blessed beyond measure by the grace of God. Their fields were fertile, their flocks were fat, their storehouses were full to overflowing. They had gold and silver, fine clothes, and beautiful houses, everything that heart could desire. But instead of falling on their faces in gratitude before the God who had given them all these blessings, they had lifted up their hearts in pride. They walked through their streets with their chins held high, their eyes looking down on everyone around them. They had forgotten that every good gift comes from above, from the Father of lights who gives generously to all. The morning sun climbed higher, and the city came alive with activity. But what the angels saw was not the honest work of humble people grateful for another day. Instead, they saw a parade of vanity and self-worship that would have been laughable if it had not been so tragic. Wealthy merchants strutted through the marketplaces like peacocks, their robes flowing behind them, their jewelry glinting in the sunlight. They spoke in loud voices about their riches, their successful trades, their growing power. Each tried to outdo the others with tales of their own importance, their own wisdom, their own success. The women were no better. They walked through the streets with their heads held high, their necks stretched out like swans, their eyes flashing with contempt for anyone they considered beneath them. Their clothes were made of the finest fabrics, their ornaments were of gold and precious stones, but their hearts were harder than the jewelry they wore. But it was not just the rich who had fallen prey to this sin. Even the poor had been infected with pride, boasting about the little they had, putting on airs they could not afford, looking down on their neighbors for the smallest differences in station or wealth. The whole city had become a competition to see who could think most highly of themselves. The angels watched as a group of city elders gathered in the gate to conduct business. These were supposed to be the wisest men in Sodom, the ones who made decisions for the good of all the people. But instead of seeking justice and mercy, they spent their time arguing about their own honor, their own precedence, their own importance in the city. One old man, his beard white as snow, but his heart black as coal, stood up and began to speak. His voice was loud and pompous, filled with the sound of his own importance. "Citizens of Sodom," he declared, spreading his arms wide as if he were embracing the whole world. "Look around you and see what we have accomplished. Our city is the greatest in all the world, our wealth beyond counting, our power feared by all our enemies." The crowd cheered, their voices echoing off the stone walls like the roar of lions. But the angels could see what the people could not. They could see how empty these boasts were, how hollow these claims of greatness. They could see that the foundations of the city were already cracking under the weight of so much pride. "We owe our success to no one but ourselves," the old man continued, his voice growing even louder. "Our wisdom, our strength, Our cunning have made us what we are. We are like gods among men, masters of our own destiny." At these words, the very air seemed to shiver with divine anger. The angels looked at each other with eyes full of sorrow and righteous wrath. To hear mortal men compare themselves to the eternal God, to hear them claim credit for blessings that came from heaven alone, was almost more than they could bear. But the old man was not finished with his blasphemy. He raised his fist toward the sky, shaking it at the very throne of God. "If there are gods above us," he shouted, "let them prove their power. Let them show us that they are greater than we are. We fear no one, bow to no one, serve no one but ourselves." The crowd erupted in wild applause, their voices raised in agreement with this terrible challenge to heaven. They had become so drunk on their own pride that they could no longer see the danger they were in. They were like ants challenging the storm, like candles claiming to outshine the sun. As the day wore on, the angels saw this pride manifested in 1,000 different ways. They saw parents teaching their children to despise the poor and weak. They saw judges taking bribes and perverting justice because they thought themselves above the law. They saw priests in the temples offering sacrifices to false gods while claiming to be wiser than the true prophets. In the wealthy district of the city, they found houses built like palaces, with towers reaching toward the sky, as if their owners were trying to climb to heaven by their own strength. The people who lived in these houses surrounded themselves with flattering servants who told them every day how wonderful they were, how much better than everyone else. One wealthy woman, her fingers heavy with rings and her neck draped with pearls, sat on a golden chair while a dozen servants fanned her with peacock feathers and fed her grapes one by one. Around her, musicians played soft melodies, while poets recited verses about her beauty and wisdom. But the angels could see what her servants and flatterers could not. They could see that her beauty was fading like a flower in the desert sun, that her wisdom was nothing but foolishness dressed up in fancy words. They could see that all her wealth and power were like morning dew that would vanish at the first touch of heat. "I am like a goddess," she said to her servants, her voice smooth as honey but poisonous as snake venom. "The gods themselves must envy my perfection. Surely I deserve to be worshipped as they are." Her servants nodded and smiled, but the angels could see the fear in their eyes. They knew that their mistress was mad with pride, but they dared not say so. They had seen what happened to servants who displeased their masters in Sodom. As the sun reached its highest point in the sky, the angels made their way to the center of the city, where the greatest temple stood. This should have been a place of humble worship, where people came to bow before the God who had made them and blessed them. Instead, they found it turned into a monument to human pride. The priests of this temple had set up statues of themselves alongside the statues of the gods. They encouraged the people to worship not just the divine powers, but the human wisdom and strength that had supposedly built the city. The very walls were covered with paintings that showed the people of Sodom as giants among men, as heroes and demigods who deserved the praise of all the world. The head priest, a fat man whose robes were more expensive than the clothes of kings, stood before the altar offering incense to a golden statue. But the angels could see that the statue was not of any god. It was a statue of the priest himself, made in gold and adorned with jewels, set up so that people would bow down to his image. "Behold the greatness of man," the priest cried, spreading his arms wide before his own statue. We have risen above our humble beginnings and made ourselves like the gods. We have conquered the earth and made it our footstool. The people in the temple cheered and applauded, their hearts so filled with pride that they could no longer tell the difference between the Creator and the created, between the eternal God and the mortal men who claimed to be his equals. But even as they celebrated their own greatness, the angels could see the signs that judgment was coming. The ground beneath the city was trembling, so slightly that human senses could not detect it. But the foundations were already beginning to crack. The very air was growing thick and heavy, as if a great storm was building just beyond the horizon. High on the hills outside the city, Abraham felt the change in the atmosphere and fell to his knees in prayer. He could sense that something terrible was about to happen, that the patience of heaven was finally reaching its end. He lifted his eyes toward the sky and saw clouds gathering where there had been clear blue just moments before. The second mystery was solved. The pride of Sodom and Gomorrah was complete, their arrogance total. They had forgotten that they were made from dust and would return to dust. They had claimed the glory that belonged to God alone and made themselves the center of their own worship. But pride always comes before a fall, and the fall of these cities would be more terrible than anything the world had ever seen. The God who had lifted them up could cast them down, and the gods they had made of themselves would crumble into nothing when the true God showed his power. The angels looked at each other with eyes full of righteous anger and divine sorrow. 2 mysteries had been solved, but 3 more remained. And with each revelation, the case for destruction grew stronger, the evidence more overwhelming. The morning was ending, and the heat of the day was beginning to build. But soon, a heat far greater than any earthly fire would fall upon these cities, and all their pride would be turned to ash, and all their arrogance to dust. Chapter 4. The third sin, lack of hospitality. The sun climbed higher into the sky, and the heat began to shimmer off the stone streets of Sodom like waves of invisible fire. The angels continued their investigation, their hearts growing heavier with each step as they discovered the depth of corruption that had infected every part of these once blessed cities. The third sin they came to investigate was one that struck at the very heart of what it meant to be human. In the ancient world, hospitality was not just a nice gesture or a social custom. It was a sacred duty, a holy obligation that separated civilized people from wild beasts. To welcome a stranger, to offer food and shelter to someone in need, was to participate in the divine nature of God himself, who had always been a refugee for the homeless and a provider for the hungry. But in Sodom and Gomorrah, this sacred tradition had been not just forgotten, but deliberately trampled underfoot. The people had turned their hearts to stone against anyone who was not like them, anyone who was not part of their proud and prosperous community. As the angels walked through the marketplace, they saw scene after scene that made their immortal hearts ache with grief. An old man, his clothes torn and dusty from days of travel, sat beside the city gate with his hand outstretched, begging for just a crust of bread or a cup of water. But the people of Sodom walked past him as if he were invisible, their eyes turned away, their faces hard as flint. Some did more than simply ignore him. The angels watched in horror as young men, the sons of wealthy families, took sport in tormenting the old beggar. They threw stones at him, just small ones at first, laughing when he cried out and tried to shield himself with his thin arms. when he begged them to stop, they only laughed louder and threw larger stones. "Please," the old man whispered, his voice barely audible above the cruel laughter. "I have traveled far. I only need a little food, a place to rest for the night. I am someone's father, someone's grandfather. Have mercy." But mercy was a word that had been erased from the vocabulary of Sodom. One of the young men, his face twisted with contempt, picked up a handful of mud from the street and hurled it at the beggar's face. "We don't want your kind here, old man," he snarled. "This city is for the strong, the successful, the beautiful. There's no place here for weak, useless beggars like you." The old man wiped the mud from his eyes, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. He struggled to his feet and began to walk away, but his legs were weak from hunger and exhaustion. He stumbled and fell, and the young men burst into fresh laughter at his pain. The angels wanted to intervene, to protect this innocent sufferer, but they knew they must complete their investigation first. They must see how deep this cruelty ran, how completely the hearts of the people had been turned to stone. They followed the old man as he made his way through the streets, looking for someone, anyone, who might show him kindness. At house after house, he knocked on doors, his voice growing weaker with each plea for help. "Please," he would whisper when a door opened. "I don't need much. Just a corner to sleep in, a bit of bread if you can spare it. I will work for whatever you give me." But every door slammed shut in his face. Some people didn't even bother to answer his knock. Others opened their doors just long enough to curse him and threaten him with violence if he didn't move on. At one house, a woman answered the door holding a loaf of fresh bread. The smell of it made the old man's empty stomach cramp with hunger. He could see that she had plenty, that her kitchen was full of good food, that her family was well fed and comfortable. "Please, kind lady," he begged, his voice breaking with desperation. "Just a small piece of bread. I haven't eaten in 3 days." The woman looked at him with eyes as cold as winter stones. Then, deliberately, she took a bite of the bread right in front of him, chewing slowly while staring into his hungry eyes. "This bread is for decent people," she said when she had swallowed. "Not for worthless vagrants who bring shame to our beautiful city. Find somewhere else to beg, old fool." She slammed the door so hard that the sound echoed through the street like a thunderclap. The old man stood there for a moment, swaying on his feet, then slowly sank to his knees right there on her doorstep. But the woman was not finished with her cruelty. She opened the door again and threw a bucket of dirty water over the old man's head, soaking him to the skin and leaving him shivering in the growing heat of the day. "That's to wash the stench of poverty off my doorstep," she said with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Now get away from my house before I call the guards to beat you." The angels watched all of this with hearts full of righteous anger. They had seen how the people of earth could be cruel to each other. But this level of hardness, this complete absence of compassion, was something that shocked even their heavenly sensibilities. As the day wore on, they saw more and more examples of this terrible sin. They saw families who had so much food that it rotted in their storehouses, while beggars starved just outside their gates. They saw wealthy merchants who would rather dump their extra grain in the river than give it to hungry travelers. They saw children being taught to despise outsiders, to view anyone who was different as an enemy to be driven away. They watched as mothers instructed their sons and daughters to throw rocks at strangers, to spit on foreigners, to make life miserable for anyone who dared to seek help in their city. In one terrible scene, the angels witnessed a group of men catching a foreign woman who had come to the city seeking medicine for her sick child. Instead of helping her, they dragged her to the edge of town and beat her with sticks until she was bloody and broken. Then they threw her belongings into the river and told her that if she ever came back, they would kill her. But perhaps the most heartbreaking thing the angels saw was how this cruelty had infected even those who should have been protectors of the weak. The priests, who should have been teaching compassion and mercy, instead preached sermons about keeping the city pure by driving out undesirable people. The judges, who should have been ensuring justice for all, instead passed laws making it illegal to help strangers or give aid to the poor. The angels found one law written on a stone tablet in the center of the city that made their immortal blood run cold. Any citizen who gives food, water, or shelter to a foreigner shall be stripped of their possessions and driven from the city. Any foreigner who remains in the city for more than one day shall be beaten and expelled. This law had turned what should have been a natural human instinct into a crime punishable by exile. The people had not only abandoned hospitality, they had made it illegal to show mercy. As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the western hills, the angels made their way to the part of the city where Lot lived. Here, at least, they found one house where the ancient traditions were still honored, where strangers were still welcomed and protected. But even Lot's kindness was under constant attack from his neighbors. The angels could see that he was treated as an outsider himself, mocked and scorned by the other residents of Sodom for his strange habit of showing mercy to strangers. As they approached Lot's house, they overheard a conversation between some of his neighbors that revealed just how deeply the hatred of hospitality had taken root in the city. "There goes Lot again," one woman said to another, pointing at Lot's house where smoke rose from the cooking fires. "Always taking in vagrants and beggars. He thinks he's better than the rest of us." "Someone should report him to the authorities," the other woman replied, her voice sharp with malice. "He's breaking the law by helping those worthless foreigners. He's making our whole neighborhood look bad." "I heard he gave shelter to a whole family last week," the first woman continued. "A man and woman with 3 children, all dirty and poor. Can you imagine? They probably stole things from his house while they were there. Mark my words," the second woman said with a cruel smile. "One day, those strangers he helps will turn on him. He'll learn that kindness is weakness, and weakness gets you killed in this world." The angels listened to this conversation with growing sorrow. They could see that Lot's acts of mercy, which should have been praised and imitated, were instead viewed as signs of weakness and foolishness. The whole moral order of the city had been turned upside down, so that good was called evil, and evil was called good. They watched as Lot himself came out of his house to draw water from the well. Even this simple act was done with care and generosity. When he saw that the public water jar was nearly empty, he filled it from his own well so that anyone who came by would have something to drink. But as soon as he went back inside, some of the neighborhood children ran out and deliberately knocked over the water jar, spilling all the fresh water into the dirt. They laughed and ran away, leaving any thirsty traveler who might come by to find nothing but mud. The angels realized that Lot was like a single candle burning in a cave of darkness. His light made the darkness around him seem even blacker by comparison, and the people of Sodom hated him for it. They wanted everyone to be as hard-hearted as they were, and his kindness was a constant reminder of what they had lost. As evening approached, the angels witnessed one final scene that sealed the fate of the cities beyond any hope of mercy. A young mother, carrying a baby in her arms and leading a small child by the hand, appeared at the city gates just as the sun was setting. She was clearly a refugee, fleeing from some disaster, her clothes torn and her face marked by exhaustion and fear. The gatekeepers saw her coming and immediately began to close the heavy gates. But the woman ran forward, her baby crying in her arms, and fell to her knees before them. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "My husband was killed by bandits on the road. I have been walking for days with my children. We need shelter for just one night. My baby is sick and needs rest." The gatekeepers looked down at her with faces like stone. One of them, a man whose belly showed that he had never known hunger, spat in the dust at her feet. "Read the law, woman," he said, pointing to the stone tablet with its cruel words. "No foreigners allowed in the city. No aid to strangers. Find somewhere else to die." "But my baby," the woman pleaded, holding up her infant who was burning with fever. "Please, just let me buy some medicine. I have a little silver left. I'm not asking for charity, just the chance to save my child's life." The other gatekeeper laughed, a sound like bones breaking. "Your silver is worthless here, stranger. We don't trade with your kind. Take your sick baby and get away from our gates before we set the dogs on you." The woman tried one more time, her voice breaking with desperation. "In the name of whatever gods you serve, show mercy to these innocent children. They have done nothing wrong. Let them die inside walls instead of out here with the wild animals." But her words only made the gatekeepers angry. They called for the guards, who came running with clubs in their hands. The woman, seeing that she was about to be beaten, gathered her children close and ran back into the wilderness, her baby's cries growing fainter as she disappeared into the gathering darkness. The angels watched her go with hearts full of divine wrath. This innocent woman and her children would likely die in the wilderness because the people of Sodom had turned their hearts to stone against all strangers. The sin of inhospitality was not just a matter of being rude or unwelcoming. It was a matter of life and death, and the people of these cities had chosen death for anyone who was not one of them. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the angels looked at each other with eyes that burned like coals. The third mystery was solved, and it was as terrible as the first two. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah had not only abandoned the sacred duty of hospitality, they had turned it into its opposite, making cruelty to strangers a virtue and mercy a crime. The night was falling, but for the angels, the investigation was far from over. Two more mysteries remained, two more sins that had brought heaven's attention to these doomed cities. And with each revelation, the case for destruction grew stronger, the evidence more overwhelming. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the clear sky, though no clouds were visible. The very air seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the final acts of this terrible drama to unfold. The third sin had been laid bare, but the worst was yet to come. Chapter 5, the fourth sin, oppression of the poor and needy. The night deepened over Sodom and Gomorrah, but the angels' work was far from finished. As they moved through the shadowy streets, their immortal eyes piercing the darkness that hid the city's sins from mortal sight, They prepared to investigate the fourth great mystery that had brought heaven's wrath upon these once blessed places. This sin was perhaps the most heartbreaking of all, because it revealed how completely the people had forgotten the heart of God. The Lord had always been the defender of the helpless, the father of the fatherless, the judge who stood up for those who had no one else to speak for them. But in Sodom and Gomorrah, the poor and needy had become invisible, their cries for help falling on ears that had been deliberately deafened by greed and selfishness. As the angels walked through the wealthy district of Sodom, they saw sights that would have made the stones themselves weep if stones had hearts. Great houses rose up on either side of the street like mountains of marble and gold, their windows glowing with the light of 1,000 oil lamps, their gardens filled with exotic plants, watered by fountains that never ran dry. But just beyond the walls of these palaces, in the narrow alleys where the rich never walked, the angels found a different world entirely. Here, in the shadows cast by the mansions of the wealthy, the poor huddled together like forgotten ghosts, their bodies wasted by hunger, their clothes little more than rags held together by hope and desperation. The contrast was so stark, so overwhelming, that it seemed impossible that both worlds could exist in the same city. It was as if the wealthy had built their paradise on top of a hidden hell, where human beings suffered and died just out of sight of those who could have helped them with the smallest gesture of their hands. In one alley, the angels found an old woman sitting against a wall, her body so thin that she seemed to be nothing but skin stretched over bones. In her arms, she held a baby, her grandchild perhaps, whose cries had grown weak from hunger. Beside her, 2 other small children slept fitfully on the hard ground, their stomachs swollen from starvation. The woman looked up as the angels approached, and in her eyes they saw not just physical hunger, but a deeper pain, the anguish of someone who had been forgotten by the world. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper. "Kind strangers," she said, though she could not see their true nature in the darkness. "Do you have even a crumb of bread to spare? My grandchildren have not eaten in 4 days. I would work for food, but I am too weak to stand." The angels' hearts broke at her words, but they knew they could not reveal themselves yet. They were here to witness, to investigate, to see how deep the cruelty ran. But even as they stood there, they heard footsteps approaching from the main street. A rich merchant, his belly round from years of good eating, his clothes made of the finest silk, appeared at the mouth of the alley. He had been walking home from a feast where he had eaten more food than this family would see in a month. In his hands, he carried a bag full of leftover delicacies from the dinner, food that would spoil if not eaten soon. The old woman saw him and struggled to her feet, swaying from weakness as she approached him with trembling hands outstretched. "Please, good sir," she begged, her voice breaking with desperation. "Just a little food for the children. They are so hungry, and I have nothing to give them." The merchant looked at her with disgust, as if she were something unclean that had crawled out of the sewers. He could see the starving children behind her, could hear the baby's weak cries, but his heart remained as hard as the gold coins in his purse. "Get away from me, you filthy beggar," he snarled, pulling his expensive robes closer to his body as if poverty were a disease he might catch. "I work hard for my wealth. I don't give handouts to lazy people who won't work for themselves." "But the children," the woman pleaded, falling to her knees before him. "They are innocent. They have done nothing wrong. Please, just a little bread." the merchant's face twisted with anger at her persistence. He looked down at the bag of food in his hands, then deliberately turned and dumped all of it into the gutter, where it mixed with the sewage and garbage that flowed through the streets. "There," he said with a cruel laugh. "Now no one can have it. That's what beggars deserve for bothering their betters." He walked away, leaving the old woman kneeling in the filth, watching the good food that could have saved her grandchildren's lives slowly dissolving into the muck. The angels saw her shoulders shake with silent sobs, her spirit breaking under the weight of such deliberate cruelty. This scene was repeated throughout the city, in 100 different variations. The angels saw wealthy families throwing away half-eaten meals, while hungry children pressed their faces against the windows, watching the waste with hollow eyes. They saw granaries full to overflowing with grain that was left to rot, rather than be given to those who needed it. In the marketplace, they witnessed merchants deliberately destroying food, rather than lowering their prices so that the poor could afford it. One baker, his shop filled with fresh bread, took dozens of unsold loaves at the end of the day, and fed them to his pigs, rather than give them to the starving families who begged outside his door. "I would rather feed swine than feed the undeserving poor," he declared to anyone who would listen. If they wanted bread, they should have worked harder to earn the money to buy it. But perhaps the most heartbreaking scene the angels witnessed was in the house of a wealthy widow, a woman who had more riches than she could spend in 10 lifetimes. Her storehouses were filled with grain, her cellars with wine, her treasuries with gold and silver. She had so much that she had to hire guards just to keep track of it all. Outside her gates, a young mother sat with her sick child, a little boy whose body was burning with fever. The mother had been there for 3 days, begging for just enough money to buy medicine that could save her son's life. The cost would have been nothing to the wealthy widow, less than she spent on perfume for her morning bath. The angels watched as the widow looked out her window at the pleading mother and child. For a moment, her face seemed to soften, and hope flickered in the mother's eyes. But then the widow's expression hardened again, and she turned away from the window. "Guard," she called to one of her servants, "that woman is making noise outside my gates. It's disturbing my peace. Have her removed." The guard went out and roughly dragged the mother and her sick child away from the gates, throwing them into the street like pieces of garbage. The little boy's weak cries echoed off the stone walls as his mother tried to comfort him, knowing that without medicine he would likely not live through the night. The wealthy widow heard those cries from inside her comfortable house, but she simply had her servants play music louder to drown out the sound of suffering. She went to sleep that night on silk sheets, while just outside her walls a mother held her dying child and wept. The angels discovered that this hardness of heart was not just individual cruelty, but had been built into the very structure of the city's society. The laws were written to protect the wealthy and oppress the poor. The courts took bribes from the rich and ignored the pleas of those who had nothing to offer but justice. They found judges who would not even hear cases brought by poor people unless they could pay fees that were impossible for them to afford. They saw tax collectors who took everything from struggling families, leaving them with nothing, while the wealthy found ways to hide their riches and pay almost nothing. The temples, which should have been places of refuge for the needy, had been turned into businesses that served only those who could pay. The priests demanded expensive offerings before they would even pray for someone, and they threw out anyone who came seeking help without gold or silver to offer. In one temple, the angels watched as a desperate father brought his dying daughter to the priests, begging them to pray for her healing. The child was clearly very ill, her small body racked with pain. But the priests looked at the father's poor clothes and empty hands and shook their heads. "Prayer is not free," the head priest declared, his voice cold as winter stone. "Bring us an offering worthy of the gods' attention, and then we will consider interceding for your daughter." "But I have nothing left," the father cried, falling to his knees before the altar. "I have sold everything I owned to buy medicine for her. Please, just a simple prayer. It costs you nothing." The priest's eyes flashed with anger at this suggestion that his prayers were worthless. "Nothing?" he roared. "My prayers are sacred, blessed by the gods themselves. They are worth more than gold and silver. How dare you suggest that I should give them away for free?" He gestured to his guards, who seized the father and his sick daughter and threw them out of the temple into the street. The little girl landed hard on the stone pavement, her weak cry of pain cutting through the air like a knife through the angels' hearts. As the night wore on, the angels saw that this oppression of the poor was not just about money or material needs. It was about the complete dehumanization of anyone who did not have wealth or power. The poor were treated like animals, or worse than animals, because at least animals were sometimes shown mercy. They watched as children born into poverty were denied any chance at education or advancement, condemned to lives of misery simply because their parents had nothing. They saw sick people turned away from healers because they could not pay, left to suffer and die in the streets while those with money received the best care available. The angels realized that the wealthy of Sodom and Gomorrah had created a system where compassion itself had been turned into a commodity, to be bought and sold. Love, mercy, kindness, healing, hope, all of these gifts from God had been twisted into things that only the rich could afford. But perhaps the most damning evidence of this sin was found in the city's own records, written on stone tablets and stored in the archives of the palace. These records showed that the rulers of Sodom and Gomorrah had deliberately created policies designed to keep the poor trapped in poverty. They had established laws that made it illegal for poor people to work in certain trades, keeping the best jobs reserved for the wealthy. They had created taxes that fell most heavily on those who could least afford them, while giving the rich countless ways to avoid paying their fair share. Most shocking of all, they had passed laws that made it a crime to help the poor in certain ways. Anyone who tried to organize the needy or who spoke out against the injustices they suffered could be imprisoned or even executed for disturbing the peace. The angels found records of good-hearted people who had tried to stand up for the oppressed, only to be crushed by the weight of the system. Merchants who had tried to sell food at fair prices to the poor had been driven out of business by the wealthy who controlled the trade guilds. Physicians who had tried to treat the sick regardless of their ability to pay had been stripped of their licenses and forbidden to practice. Even some priests and judges who had tried to show mercy had been removed from their positions and replaced with harder men who would do exactly what the wealthy demanded. The whole system had been designed to squeeze every drop of compassion out of the city, leaving only greed and selfishness behind. As dawn began to break over the city, painting the sky with shades of gold and crimson, the angels looked at each other with eyes full of divine wrath. The fourth mystery was solved, and it was perhaps the most terrible of all. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah had not just ignored the poor and needy. They had deliberately created a system designed to grind them down and destroy them. They had taken the commandments of God, who had always demanded justice for the oppressed and mercy for the helpless, and turned them completely upside down. They had made cruelty into a virtue and compassion into a crime. The morning light revealed the full scope of the tragedy. In the wealthy districts, the houses gleamed like jewels in the rising sun, their owners awakening to breakfasts that could have fed a dozen poor families. But in the shadows of those same houses, the bodies of those who had died in the night from hunger and neglect lay forgotten in the alleys, already being picked over by the scavenger birds. 4 mysteries had now been solved, 4 terrible sins exposed in all their horror. But one more remained, and it would prove to be the most damning of all. For it was one thing to fall into sin through weakness or ignorance, but quite another to persist in evil even when shown the way to redemption. The angels prepared for their final investigation, knowing that what they found would seal the fate of these doomed cities forever. The sun climbed higher into the sky, but they could see dark clouds gathering on the horizon, and the very air seemed to tremble with the approach of divine judgment. Chapter 6, The Fifth Sin, Rebellion Against God and Unrepentance. The morning sun climbed higher into the sky over Sodom and Gomorrah, but even its golden light couldn't dispel the darkness that the angels had found in every corner of these cities. 4 great sins had been exposed, 4 terrible mysteries solved, but now came the investigation of the 5th and final abomination that had brought heaven's wrath upon this place. This last sin was perhaps the most damning of all, because it revealed not just weakness or ignorance, but a deliberate choice to turn away from the light. It was the sin of rebellion against God himself, coupled with a hardness of heart that refused to repent, even when mercy was offered. The angels had seen sexual immorality that corrupted the very foundations of human love. They had witnessed pride that lifted mortal men above their Creator. They had observed the cruel abandonment of hospitality and the deliberate oppression of the poor. But all of these sins, terrible as they were, might have been forgiven if the people had shown even a spark of remorse, even a whisper of desire to turn from their evil ways. Instead, what the angels found was something that chilled their immortal hearts, a complete and utter rejection of God's authority, a proud defiance that grew stronger with every act of divine mercy, and a hardness of heart that seemed to be carved from stone itself. As they walked through the streets in the growing light of day, the angels began to see evidence of this final sin written everywhere. In the temples of the city, they found altars dedicated not to the true God who had created and blessed these people, but to idols made by human hands, statues of gold and silver, carved wood and polished stone, all representing false gods who demanded nothing but worship and gave nothing in return. But these were not just any idols. Many of them were carved in the image of the people themselves, particularly the wealthy and powerful rulers of the cities. The people had literally made gods of themselves, creating shrines where they could worship their own power and wisdom. In the greatest temple of Sodom, the angels found a massive golden statue of the city's king, a man who had declared himself to be divine, and demanded that his subjects bow down before his image. Around the base of the statue were carved the words that made the angels' eyes burn with righteous anger. I am the Lord of this city. I bow to no God, serve no master, fear no power but my own. The people came to this temple not to humble themselves before their Creator, but to celebrate their own greatness and independence. They offered sacrifices not in gratitude for God's blessings, but in honor of their own achievements. They sang songs not of praise to the Almighty, but of praise to themselves and their human rulers. But even more shocking than this idol worship was the evidence of how the people had responded to the warnings God had sent them over the years. The angels found records of prophets who had come to these cities, holy men sent by the Lord to call the people to repentance. Instead of listening to these messengers of mercy, the people of Sodom and Gomorrah had mocked them, beaten them, and driven them away. One stone tablet told the story of a prophet named Uriah, who had stood in the marketplace and called the people to turn from their evil ways. For 40 days he had preached about the coming judgment, warning that God's patience would not last forever. He had begged them to repent, to return to the ways of righteousness, to remember the God who had blessed them with such abundance. The people's response was recorded in detail on the tablet, and it made the angels weep with sorrow. Instead of falling on their faces in repentance, the crowds had laughed at the prophet's warnings. They had thrown rotten fruit at him, pelted him with stones, and mocked his every word. "Who is this God you speak of?" they had shouted at him. "We see no God but ourselves. We have made our own prosperity, built our own cities, created our own power. Why should we bow to some invisible spirit when we have made ourselves like gods?" When the prophet persisted in his warnings, speaking of the fire that would fall from heaven if they did not repent, the people grew even more defiant. They built a great bonfire in the marketplace and threw the prophet's scrolls into the flames, dancing around the fire and singing songs that mocked the very idea of divine judgment. "Let your God send his fire," they had chanted, their voices rising in terrible harmony. "We are not afraid. We have conquered the earth and made ourselves its masters. No power in heaven or earth can stand against us." The prophet had left the city that very night, shaking the dust from his feet as a testimony against them, just as God's messengers would do in later generations when their warnings were rejected. But Uriah was not the only prophet the cities had rejected. The angels found evidence of messenger after messenger who had been sent by God to call these people to repentance. Some had been beaten and left for dead. Others had been imprisoned until they agreed to stop preaching. A few had simply disappeared, and everyone knew they had been murdered for daring to speak against the city's sins. Each rejection of God's messengers had made the people's hearts harder, more defiant, more determined to go their own way, regardless of the consequences. It was as if each act of mercy from heaven only strengthened their resolve to rebel against their Creator. The angels discovered that this pattern of rebellion had been going on for generations. The older people in the cities told stories of their grandparents who had also rejected God's warnings and lived to see great prosperity as a result. This had convinced them that either God did not exist or that he was too weak to carry out his threats of judgment. "Look around you," the elderly people would tell their children and grandchildren. "Our fathers rejected the warnings of the prophets. And what happened? Did fire fall from heaven? Did the earth open up and swallow the city? No. Instead, we grew richer and more powerful than ever before. These threats from heaven are nothing but empty words meant to frighten the weak and superstitious." This teaching had been passed down from generation to generation, until the people had become completely convinced that they were beyond the reach of divine justice. They believed that their wealth and power made them untouchable, that their success proved they were right to reject the authority of any god. The angels found schools where children were taught to laugh at the stories of God's judgment on other cities. They were told that the destruction of places like Babel was just a myth, a story made up to frighten people into obedience. The teachers filled their students' minds with pride and rebellion, convincing them that human wisdom was superior to any divine revelation. In one school, the angels listened to a teacher addressing a class of young people, his voice filled with contempt for everything sacred. "Children," he said, spreading his arms wide as if embracing the whole world, "you have been blessed to be born in the greatest cities ever built by human hands. Your ancestors have proven that men can be their own gods, can create their own destiny, can build their own paradise without any help from imaginary spirits in the sky." The students nodded eagerly, their young faces shining with the same pride that had infected their elders. One boy, no more than 12 years old, raised his hand and asked, "But teacher, what about the stories of the great flood? Didn't a god destroy the whole world once?" The teacher laughed, a sound like breaking pottery. "Foolish child, if there really had been such a flood, how could anyone have survived to tell the story? No, these are just tales told by weak people who cannot accept that humans are the masters of their own fate." Another student, a young girl with eyes bright with curiosity, asked, "But what if the prophets are right? What if there really is a God who judges the wicked?" The teacher's face darkened with anger at this question. "There is no judgment except what we make for ourselves. There is no God except the gods we create. You must learn to trust in your own power, your own wisdom, your own strength. Anyone who tells you otherwise is trying to make you weak and afraid." The angels could see how this teaching was poisoning the minds of the young, filling them with the same rebellious spirit that had infected their parents and grandparents. Each new generation was being raised to be even more defiant than the last, even more convinced that they were beyond the reach of divine justice. But perhaps the most shocking evidence of this rebellious spirit was found in the way the people had responded to the natural disasters that had begun to plague the region in recent years. Instead of seeing these as warnings from heaven, they had interpreted them as challenges to be overcome by human ingenuity. When earthquakes had begun to shake the foundations of their buildings, they had simply built stronger foundations and declared themselves victorious over the forces of nature. When droughts had threatened their crops, they had dug deeper wells and built elaborate irrigation systems, boasting that they could make the desert bloom through their own efforts. When strange illnesses had begun to appear among their livestock, they had developed new medicines and treatments, claiming that human knowledge was superior to any divine healing. Each time they overcame one of these challenges, their pride grew greater and their defiance more complete. The angels found records of a great assembly that had been held just 1 year before their arrival, where the leaders of both cities had stood before the people and made a formal declaration of independence from any divine authority. "Citizens of Sodom and Gomorrah," the king had proclaimed, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the great amphitheater. "Today, we declare ourselves free from the superstitions of our ancestors. Today, we proclaim that we need no gods, fear no spirits, bow to no invisible powers." The crowd had erupted in wild cheering, their voices raised in a chant that made the very air tremble with blasphemy. "We are our own gods. We are our own masters. We fear nothing in heaven or earth. This assembly had passed laws formally forbidding the worship of any god except the official deities of the state, which were really just representations of human power and wisdom. They had declared that anyone caught praying to the God of Abraham would be arrested and punished as a traitor to the city. Even more shocking, they had issued a formal challenge to heaven itself, daring God to prove his existence by sending some kind of judgment upon them. They had set up a great stone monument in the center of the city with words carved deep into its surface. To whatever gods may exist, we reject your authority, mock your power, and defy your judgment. If you truly rule the universe, then prove it by destroying us. Until then, we will worship only ourselves. This monument had stood for a full year, and with each passing day that no judgment fell, the people grew more convinced that they had been right to rebel. They pointed to their continued prosperity, their growing power, their expanding wealth, as proof that either God did not exist or was too weak to challenge them. The angels stood before this monument of blasphemy, reading its defiant words with hearts full of divine sorrow and righteous anger. This was not just sin, born of weakness or ignorance. This was deliberate, calculated rebellion against the throne of heaven itself. This was the creature spitting in the face of its creator, the clay mocking the potter who had shaped it. But even as they stood there, the angels could see that the time of testing was nearly over. The fifth and final mystery was solved, and it was the most damning evidence of all. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah had not just fallen into sin. They had chosen evil with full knowledge of the consequences. They had not just ignored God's warnings. They had actively defied them and dared heaven to do its worst. In the distance, thunder began to roll across the sky, though no clouds were visible in the clear morning air. The ground beneath the cities trembled, so slightly that only the angels could feel it. But the trembling was growing stronger with each passing moment. The investigation was complete. The 5 great sins had been exposed in all their terrible reality: sexual immorality, pride, lack of hospitality, oppression of the poor, and now the ultimate rebellion against God himself. Each sin was damning on its own, but together they painted a picture of corruption so complete that it left no room for mercy. High on the hills above the valley, Abraham felt the change in the atmosphere and fell to his knees in prayer. His heart was breaking as he realized that his worst fears were about to be realized. The cities below were about to face the wrath of the Almighty, and nothing he could do would save them now. The angels looked at each other with eyes that burned like stars, and in their gaze was the terrible certainty of coming judgment. The mysteries were solved, the evidence was complete, and the verdict was sealed. Sodom and Gomorrah had chosen their fate, and heaven would give them exactly what they had asked for. The morning sun climbed higher, but dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the very air seemed to crackle with divine electricity. The time of investigation was over. The time of judgment had come. Chapter 7. The Climax of Judgment. The morning air grew thick and heavy, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath in anticipation of what was about to unfold. The angels had completed their investigation, and the evidence was overwhelming. 5 great sins had been laid bare, 5 mysteries solved, and the verdict was unanimous. Sodom and Gomorrah had passed the point of no return. In the house of Lot, the 2 heavenly messengers spoke with urgent voices that carried the weight of divine authority. Their faces which had appeared gentle and human-like during the night, now began to glow with an inner light that revealed their true nature as servants of the Most High. "Do you have anyone else here?" they asked Lot, their voices echoing with supernatural power. "Sons-in-law, sons or daughters, or anyone else in the city who belongs to you. Get them out of here, because we are going to destroy this place. The outcry to the Lord against its people is so great that he has sent us to destroy it." Lot's face went white as the blood drained from his cheeks. He had known that judgment was coming, had felt it in his bones, but to hear it spoken so plainly made his knees weak with fear. He thought of his daughters, still asleep in their beds, innocent of the great sins that had condemned their city. He thought of the young men who were pledged to marry them, good men who might yet be saved if they could be convinced to flee. With trembling hands, Lot ran through the streets to the houses where his future sons-in-law lived. He pounded on their doors with desperate urgency, his voice cracking as he called out warnings that seemed to come from another world. "Get up! Get out of this place!" he shouted, his words echoing off the stone walls. "The Lord is about to destroy the city. We must flee now before it's too late." But when the young men opened their doors and saw Lot standing there with wild eyes and terror-filled voice, they only laughed at his warnings. They thought he was telling jokes, making up fantastic stories to amuse them in the early morning hours. "Oh, Lot," one of them said with a chuckle, "you always were one for dramatic tales. Destroy the city. Come now, look around you. Have you ever seen a more prosperous, more beautiful place? Why would any god want to destroy paradise itself?" The other young man nodded in agreement, his face showing the same mixture of amusement and pity that had become so common in Sodom when anyone mentioned divine judgment. "You've been listening to too many old stories, father-in-law," he said, using the term of respect, even though the marriage had not yet taken place. "Those tales of fire from heaven are just myths meant to frighten children. We live in an age of reason now, an age when men have learned to trust in themselves rather than in invisible spirits." Lot fell to his knees before them, tears streaming down his face as he begged them to believe him. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "I have seen things tonight that would turn your hair white with terror. These are not myths or old wives' tales. The angels of God himself have come to this city, and they have pronounced its doom. Please, I beg you, come with us while there is still time." But the young men only shook their heads with sad smiles, as if they were dealing with a relative who had lost his mind. They helped Lot to his feet with gentle hands, their voices kind but firm. "Go home, old man," they said softly. "Get some rest. You'll feel better after you've slept. And don't worry about us. We'll be fine. This city has stood for hundreds of years, and it will stand for hundreds more." Lot stumbled back to his house with a heart full of despair, knowing that he had failed to save the men who were meant to become part of his family. The angels were waiting for him when he returned, their faces grave with the sorrow of heaven itself. "They would not listen," Lot said, his voice barely a whisper. "They think I have lost my mind. They cannot believe that judgment is coming." The angels nodded sadly, for they had seen this pattern repeated throughout history. When God's patience finally reached its end, those who had hardened their hearts could no longer recognize the voice of truth, even when it came from the lips of those who loved them. "Then we must go," one of the angels said, his voice gentle but urgent. "Wake your wife and daughters. Take nothing but the clothes on your backs. Do not look back. Do not stop. Do not turn aside for anything. The destruction is about to begin. As Lot roused his family from their beds, the angel stepped outside his house and looked up toward the heavens. In the distance, high above the eastern hills, where Abraham kept his lonely vigil, the sky began to change. What had been clear blue moments before now showed the first signs of something terrible approaching. Dark clouds appeared from nowhere, rolling across the sky like a black tide. But these weren't ordinary storm clouds. They moved against the wind, swirling in patterns that defied all natural law, and from within them came flashes of light that were not lightning, but something far more ominous. The air itself began to change, growing thick and hard to breathe. A strange smell filled the atmosphere, like the scent of burning metal mixed with sulfur from the deepest pits of the earth. The very ground beneath the city started to tremble, as if the foundations of the world were shifting in preparation for what was to come. In Sodom and Gomorrah, the people began to notice that something was wrong. Those who were awake in the early morning hours looked up at the darkening sky with puzzled expressions. Some pointed at the strange clouds and laughed, making jokes about the unusual weather. Others felt a stirring of unease in their hearts, a primitive fear that their proud minds couldn't quite suppress. But even as the signs of coming doom multiplied around them, the people's response remained true to their rebellious nature. Instead of falling on their faces in repentance, instead of crying out to God for mercy, they gathered in the streets and shook their fists at the threatening sky. "Is this the best you can do?" They shouted at the heavens, their voices filled with the same defiance that had marked all their dealings with the divine. A few dark clouds, some thunder and lightning. We are not afraid of storms. We have weathered worse than this. In the great temple of Sodom, the priests gathered around their golden idol and began to chant prayers to their false gods, calling on them to protect the city from whatever power was gathering in the sky. They offered expensive sacrifices, poured out costly wine, and burned precious incense, all while declaring their confidence that their man-made deities would shield them from any danger. But the angels knew that the time for mercy had passed. The investigation was complete, the verdict had been rendered, and the sentence was about to be carried out. They took Lot and his family by the hands and began to lead them through the streets toward the gates of the city. "Hurry," they urged, their voices carrying an urgency that made Lot's daughters tremble with fear. "Do not delay. Every moment we waste brings us closer to the destruction." As they moved through the streets, more and more people began to notice the strange procession. Word spread quickly that Lot was leaving the city with some mysterious strangers, and soon a crowd began to gather around them. "Where are you going, Lot?" people called out, their voices filled with curiosity and confusion. "Why are you leaving at this hour? And who are these men with you?" Lot tried one last time to warn his neighbors, turning to face the growing crowd with tears streaming down his face. "Listen to me," he cried, his voice hoarse with emotion. "The Lord is about to destroy this city. Flee for your lives. Leave everything and run to the hills. Do not stay here, or you will perish with everything else." But the crowd only laughed at his words, their voices rising in mocking chorus that echoed off the buildings around them. "Old Lot has finally lost his mind," they shouted. "He thinks the world is ending. Look around you, fool. Does this look like a city that's about to be destroyed?" They pointed to the beautiful buildings, the bustling marketplaces, the evidence of prosperity and power that surrounded them on every side. To their eyes, everything looked exactly as it always had. The idea that all of this could vanish in a moment seemed not just unlikely, but impossible. But even as they mocked Lot's warnings, the sky above them continued to darken. The clouds were now so thick that they blocked out the morning sun, plunging the city into an unnatural twilight. The air grew hotter and harder to breathe, and a low rumbling sound began to echo across the valley, like the voice of the earth itself groaning in pain. The angels pressed forward through the crowd, their supernatural strength easily clearing a path despite the press of bodies around them. They reached the gates of the city just as the first drops began to fall from the sky. But these weren't drops of rain. They were drops of something else entirely, something that hissed and steamed when it hit the ground. The people who were touched by these strange drops cried out in pain and surprise, their skin burning as if they had been splashed with liquid fire. "Sulfur," one of the angels said grimly, looking up at the sky that was now completely black with roiling clouds. "It begins." They were outside the city now, standing on the plain that stretched between Sodom and the hills where Abraham waited. Behind them, the gates of the city clanged shut as the guards, finally beginning to realize that something terrible was happening, tried to protect themselves by sealing the walls. But walls of stone and gates of iron would provide no protection from what was coming. High above the clouds, the very heavens themselves were opening, and the wrath of the Almighty was about to pour down like a flood of fire. The angel who led them turned to Lot and his family one final time, his voice carrying all the authority of the throne of God. "Flee for your lives," he commanded. "Do not look back. Do not stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the hills, or you will be swept away." And then, as the first rays of what should have been full morning sunlight tried to pierce the supernatural darkness, the judgment fell. It came not as a single bolt of lightning or one great crash of thunder, but as a rain of fire that covered the entire valley. Burning sulfur fell from the sky like hailstones, each piece glowing white-hot as it plummeted toward the earth. The very air caught fire, turning the atmosphere into a furnace that consumed everything it touched. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah disappeared in an instant, their proud buildings melting like wax in the incredible heat. The streets where people had walked just moments before became rivers of molten stone. The temples where false gods had been worshipped crumbled into ash that was blown away by the furnace winds. The people had no time to run, no chance to escape. Those who had mocked God's warnings just minutes before were vaporized in the space of a heartbeat. Their proud boasts silenced forever by the power they had claimed did not exist. The sound of the destruction was like nothing that had ever been heard on earth before. It was the sound of creation itself being undone, of matter returning to the void from which it had come. It roared across the valley like the voice of eternity, drowning out every other sound in the world. Lot and his family ran for their lives across the plain, the heat of the burning city scorching their backs as they fled toward the safety of the hills. Behind them, the valley that had been green and fertile just hours before was being transformed into a wasteland of glass and ash. But Lot's wife, despite the angel's warning, could not resist the urge to look back at the city where she had spent so many years of her life. She turned her head just for a moment, just long enough to see the magnificent destruction that was consuming everything she had known. In that instant, she was transformed into a pillar of salt, a monument to the danger of looking back when God has commanded us to move forward. she stood there on the plain, a white column against the black sky, a silent testimony into the terrible power of divine judgment. Lot and his daughters continued their flight, not stopping until they reached the hills where Abraham watched in horror and amazement. The old patriarch fell to his knees as he saw the destruction of the cities, his heart breaking for his nephew and all the innocent people who had perished in the flames. The fire rained from heaven for hours, until nothing remained of Sodom and Gomorrah but twisted glass and smoking ash. The fertile valley became a wasteland where nothing would grow for generations to come. The cities that had boasted of their eternal greatness were erased from the face of the earth as completely as if they had never existed. And in the silence that followed the destruction, the voice of God himself seemed to whisper across the devastated plain. Let this be a warning to all generations. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who rebel against heaven will find that heaven is stronger than they imagined. The fires had burned themselves out, and silence settled over the valley like a shroud. Where once the great cities of Sodom and Gomorrah had stood in all their pride and splendor, now only twisted glass and smoking ruins remained. The very earth seemed to weep for what had been lost. Not the buildings or the wealth, but the souls who might have been saved if only they had chosen differently. Abraham stood on his hill, his weathered face wet with tears as he looked down at the devastation below. The smoke was still rising from the ruined cities, a dark column that reached toward heaven like a final prayer from the dead. In his heart, he felt the weight of what he had witnessed, the terrible proof that God's justice, though long delayed, would always triumph in the end. The 5 great sins had been exposed and judged. The sexual immorality that had corrupted love itself, the pride that had lifted mortal men above their Creator, the cruelty that had closed doors to strangers and hearts to the needy, the oppression that had ground the poor beneath the wheels of greed, and finally the rebellion that had shaken its fist at heaven and dared God to prove his power. Each sin alone would have been enough to bring judgment. Together, they had created a corruption so complete that mercy itself could find no foothold in the hardened hearts of the people. They had been given chance after chance to repent, warning after warning to change their ways. But they had chosen defiance over submission, pride over humility, cruelty over compassion. As the night settled over the ruined valley, Abraham made his way down from the hills to where Lot sat with his surviving daughters, all of them still in shock from their narrow escape from destruction. The old man embraced his nephew with tears in his eyes, grateful beyond words that at least some small remnant of righteousness had been preserved from the flames. "Uncle," Lot whispered, his voice broken by grief and horror. They would not listen. Even at the very end, they wouldn't believe that judgment was coming. They mocked the warnings, defied the signs, and perished in their pride. Abraham nodded sadly, his mind turning to the lessons that future generations would need to learn from this terrible day. "The heart of man is desperately wicked," he said softly, repeating words that would one day be written by a prophet, yet unborn. When people give themselves over completely to evil, when they silence the voice of conscience and mock the warnings of heaven, they seal their own fate. In the days that followed, travelers who passed through the region would tell stories of what they found in that cursed valley. The very stones had been transformed into something alien and unnatural. The ground was covered with a strange, white substance that tasted of salt and death. Nothing grew there, no bird sang, no animals grazed. It had become a place of absolute desolation, a monument to the terrible consequences of sin. But the story of Sodom and Gomorrah was not meant to be merely a tale of destruction. It was meant to be a warning, a call to repentance for all who would hear it in the generations to come. The God who had rained fire from heaven was the same God who had pleaded with the people through his prophets, the same God who had been willing to spare the cities for the sake of even 10 righteous souls. The 5 sins that had destroyed these cities weren't unique to that time and place. They were the same temptations that would face every generation of human beings until the end of time. Sexual immorality that corrupts the gift of love, pride that makes men think themselves equal to God, cruelty to strangers and the helpless, oppression of the poor and needy, and the stubborn rebellion that refuses to acknowledge any authority higher than itself. As the years passed, and the story spread throughout the ancient world, wise men and women would point to the ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah whenever they wanted to warn against the dangers of sin. Remember Sodom, they would say. Remember what happens when people give themselves over completely to evil. Remember that God's patience, though great, is not infinite. The prophet Ezekiel would one day write about these cities, explaining that their sin was not just sexual immorality, but pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, and did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty and committed abomination before me. The destruction had come not from a single sin, but from the complete corruption of everything that should have been good and holy. Jesus himself would one day point to Sodom as an example of divine judgment, warning that the cities of his own time faced the same danger if they rejected the message of repentance and salvation. It will be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment, he would say, than for the city that rejects the gospel. But even in the midst of judgment, there had been mercy. Lot and his daughters had been saved because of Abraham's prayers and Lot's own righteousness. The angels had given them every opportunity to escape, had urged them to hurry, had led them by the hand to safety. Even in his wrath, God had remembered mercy. This too was part of the lesson that the ruins would teach to future generations. No matter how dark the sin, no matter how complete the corruption, there is always hope for those who will turn to God in repentance. The same fire that destroys the wicked can purify the righteous. The same God who judges sin is ready to forgive those who humble themselves before him. As Abraham lay down to sleep on that first night after the destruction, his mind was filled with both sorrow and hope. Sorrow for all the lives that had been lost, all the souls who had chosen darkness over light. But hope too, for he knew that the God who had spoken to him was a God of justice and mercy, who desired not the death of the wicked, but that they should turn from their evil ways and live. The stars shone down on the sleeping patriarch, the same stars that had witnessed the creation of the world and would witness its final consummation. In their silent light, the ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah seemed to whisper their eternal warning. Choose this day whom you will serve. Choose humility over pride, love over lust, mercy over cruelty, obedience over rebellion. Choose life over death. And in that choice, dear brothers and sisters, lies the hope of all humanity. For though the cities of the plain are gone forever, destroyed by their own wickedness, the God who judged them is the same God who offers salvation to all who will receive it. His mercy is new every morning, his forgiveness as wide as the sky, his love as deep as the sea. Let the ashes of Sodom and Gomorrah remind us that sin leads only to destruction, but let them also remind us that righteousness leads to life. Let them warn us of the dangers of pride and rebellion, but let them also call us to humility and repentance. And now, as you drift off to peaceful sleep, let your heart be filled not with fear, but with gratitude for the God who warns us of danger, who calls us to righteousness, who offers us forgiveness and new life. Rest in the knowledge that his mercy endures forever, and that those who seek him with sincere hearts will find refuge in his love. Sleep now, beloved, under the watchful eye of the God who judges sin, but delights in mercy, who destroys the wicked, but saves the righteous, who brings down the proud, but lifts up the humble. May your dreams be filled with his peace, and may you wake to walk in his ways all the days of your life. The story is ended, but its lessons live on forever. Grace and peace be with you until the morning light.